James Carter stepped out of his truck and stretched his legs. He had been driving for hours and was hungry. The small-town diner in front of him had a glowing "Open" sign. The smell of grilled food drifted from inside. It looked like a good place to grab a meal. James adjusted his jacket, which had a patch showing his military service. He was a proud veteran, having served in the military for over 20 years. He had been through war, had seen the worst of humanity, but always believed in respect and kindness. As he pushed open the diner's door, a small bell jingled. The room was warm, filled with the sound of people chatting and silverware clinking against plates. A few customers glanced up, but one man, standing behind the counter, narrowed his eyes. Hank Dawson, the owner, was wiping his hands on a rag. He was a tall, stocky man with gray hair and a rough attitude. His expression changed the moment he saw James. His lips curled into a frown. James walked toward the counter. "Evening," he said politely. "I'd like to get a table." Hank didn't smile. Instead, he leaned on the counter and gave James a hard look. "We're full," he said, though there were several empty tables. James glanced around. The diner was far from crowded. A couple of families sat at booths, and a few older men sipped coffee at the counter. There was plenty of space. "I see some open tables," James said, keeping his voice calm. Hank let out a short laugh. "I don't think this is the place for you," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe you should try somewhere else." A hush fell over the room. A waitress froze mid-step, her eyes darting between James and Hank. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one said a word. James had faced discrimination before. It was nothing new, but it still stung. He had risked his life for his country, fought for freedom, and yet, here he was, being told he wasn't welcome in a simple diner. He took a deep breath. "Sir, I'm just here to eat," he said, his tone firm but respectful. Hank crossed his arms. "And I'm saying we don't have room." James looked at him for a long moment. He could have argued, could have made a scene, but he didn't. Instead, he gave a small nod. "All right," he said quietly. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of a young man sitting in the back of the diner. The young man looked shocked, his face tight with anger. His gaze met James's for a brief second. There was something familiar in his eyes. James didn't linger. He pushed open the door and stepped outside into the cold night air. His stomach was still empty, but more than that, he felt a deep disappointment. Inside the diner, the young man stood up suddenly. His chair scraped against the floor. The whole room seemed to hold its breath as he marched toward the counter, his fists clenched. "Dad," he said sharply, his voice filled with disbelief. Hank turned, surprised. "What?" The young man shook his head, his jaw tight. "Do you even know who that was?" Hank scoffed. "Just some guy." The young man's hands balled into fists. "No, Dad. That man is James Carter. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Hank's face paled. "James Carter," he repeated, as if the name meant something. The young man's eyes burned with frustration. "Yeah, and you're about to regret everything you just did." Hank Dawson's face twisted in confusion. "Why do you care so much, Kyle?" he asked, looking at his son. Kyle took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. "Because that man saved my life." The diner grew even quieter. A few customers exchanged glances, sensing the tension between father and son. The waitress standing nearby looked nervous. Hank frowned. "What are you talking about?" Kyle clenched his jaw. "James Carter. That man you just insulted. He's a decorated war hero. He was my commanding officer when I was deployed overseas." Hank's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He had never heard Kyle talk much about his time in the military. Now, hearing that the black veteran he had just mocked was someone important to his own son left him speechless. Kyle's voice was sharp. "You don't know, do you? You have no idea what that man has done." Hank scoffed, trying to act indifferent. So he was in the military. So what? Kyle slammed his fist on the counter, making a few customers jump. So what? He repeated, his eyes blazing. Dad, he saved me. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here right now. The weight of Kyle's words hung in the air. The other customers now looked at Hank with quiet judgment. Some shook their heads in disappointment. The waitress bit her lip and quickly turned away. Hank shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like being the center of attention, especially not like this. You're making a big deal out of nothing, he muttered, his voice lower now. Kyle let out a bitter laugh. Nothing. That's what you think this is? You humiliated a man who risked his life for this country. For me. And for people like you who don't even appreciate it. Hank crossed his arms, but his confidence was slipping. I didn't know who he was. Kyle glared at him. That doesn't matter. You shouldn't treat anyone like that. You judged him the moment he walked in. And for what? The color of his skin. Hank's face turned red. He hated being called out, especially in front of a crowd. His pride wanted to fight back, to deny it. But deep down, he knew his son was right. Kyle didn't wait for an answer. He shook his head in disgust. I'm done, Dad. He turned and stormed toward the door. Where are you going? Hank called after him. Kyle paused at the entrance, looking back over his shoulder. To find James Carter. To thank him properly. Something you should have done. With that, he pushed open the door and walked out into the night. Hank stood behind the counter, feeling the weight of the room's silence. A few customers quietly gathered their things and left. Others just stared at him, disappointment clear on their faces. The waitress hesitated before finally speaking. Mr. Dawson, maybe you should fix this. Hank didn't respond. He just looked down at the counter, his hands gripping the edge. For the first time, in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do. Kyle stepped out into the cold night, his breath visible in the crisp air. His heart was pounding with frustration. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His own father, someone he had looked up to as a kid, had just insulted the man who had saved his life. Kyle scanned the quiet street. James Carter was nowhere to be seen. He hurried to his truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the diner's parking lot. He had to find him. James couldn't have gone far. This was a small town, with only a handful of places he could have gone for food or shelter. Kyle drove through the streets, his eyes searching every sidewalk and parking lot. Finally, he spotted him. James was sitting alone on a bench near the town park, staring up at the night sky. He looked calm, but there was a heaviness in his expression. Kyle parked his truck and jumped out. He walked quickly toward James, his boots crunching against the gravel. Sir, he called out. James turned his head. When he saw Kyle, his expression didn't change. He simply nodded. You're the young man from the diner, he said in a steady voice. Kyle nodded, his throat tight. He had faced enemies in battle, had been through life-or-death situations, but standing in front of James Carter, he suddenly felt nervous. Yes, sir, Kyle said. I wanted to apologize for what happened back there. James studied him for a moment, then sighed. You don't have to apologize for your father's actions. Kyle shook his head. No, I do. He was wrong, and I should have spoken up sooner. James gave a small smile. You did speak up. That took courage. Kyle swallowed hard. It wasn't enough. You deserved better. He hesitated before adding, I don't think you remember me, but we served together. James raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Kyle nodded. It was about 3 years ago. We were stationed overseas. My unit was ambushed during a night mission. We were pinned down, and things weren't looking good. You led a rescue team that pulled us out. I was injured, but you carried me to safety. If it weren't for you. He trailed off, shaking his head. I wouldn't be standing here today. James looked at Kyle more closely, his sharp eyes studying the younger man's face. After a moment, his expression softened with recognition. I remember now. James said. You were the young Marine who got hit during that raid. Took some shrapnel in the leg. Kyle gave a small, almost embarrassed nod. That was me. James chuckled. You were tough, didn't complain once. Kyle smiled briefly, then his expression turned serious again. That's why tonight. It hurt to see my own father act that way. You risked your life for me, and he treated you like you were nothing. James sighed and looked away. Son, I've been through worse. People like your father. I've met many of them in my lifetime. Some never change. Kyle shook his head. I want him to change. I need him to change. And I think tonight might have been a wake-up call for him. James didn't respond right away. He simply looked back up at the stars. After a long pause, he said, maybe. But change doesn't happen overnight. Kyle sat down on the bench next to him. I don't know what to do, he admitted. How do I make him see what he did was wrong? James sighed. Sometimes, people have to learn things the hard way. Kyle nodded slowly. Then I'll make sure he does. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the cold air swirling around them. For the first time that night, Kyle felt hope. Hank Dawson sat alone in his diner long after closing time. The empty chairs and tables around him felt colder than usual. He stared at the counter, his hand still resting on it. The words his son had shouted kept playing in his mind. That man saved my life. Hank had always been a stubborn man. He believed in hard work, discipline, and keeping things the way they'd always been. But now, something inside him felt different. He hadn't just been rude to a stranger. He had humiliated a man who had risked his life for his country. And for his own son. The bell above the door jingled. Hank looked up and saw Kyle walk in. His son's face was serious, his movements tense. We need to talk, Kyle said, stepping forward. Hank exhaled, rubbing his face. I suppose we do. Kyle sat across from him. There was no anger in his eyes now, just disappointment. Dad, Kyle started, his voice steady. I found James. We talked. Hank swallowed. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear this, but he also knew he had no choice. He remembered me, Kyle continued. He remembered pulling me out of that fight. He remembered carrying me on his back while bullets flew past us. Kyle leaned forward, his eyes locked onto his father's. You have no idea what that man has done. He's not just some veteran. He's a hero. Hank shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know, he muttered. That's the problem. Kyle shot back. You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You just saw a man you thought didn't belong here, and you treated him like dirt. Hank flinched. He had been called a lot of things in his life, but hearing his own son say that hurt the most. Kyle sighed, shaking his head. Dad, I've always respected you, even when we didn't see eye to eye. But tonight, I was ashamed. Those words hit Hank hard. His own son, his pride and joy, had never spoken to him like this before. I don't want to be like you, Kyle continued, his voice softer now. I don't want to judge people before I know them, and I definitely don't want to disrespect a man who risked everything for this country. Hank looked away. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, shame. Kyle stood up. I don't know if you can fix this, but if you don't even try, you'll lose more than just your business, Dad. Hank's head snapped up. What do you mean? Kyle's expression was firm. I mean, you'll lose me. Silence filled the diner. Hank felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't know what to say. He had always been a man of pride, but now, for the first time, he realized pride wouldn't help him here. Kyle turned and walked to the door. Before leaving, he paused. You have a choice, Dad. You can stay the man you've always been, or you can be better. Then he was gone. Hank sat there, staring at the empty doorway. The words lingered in his mind. You can be better. For the first time in his life, Hank Dawson wondered if he truly wanted to change. And for the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had to. Hank Dawson sat in his empty diner, staring at the counter. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the late hour, but he didn't move. Kyle's words echoed in his mind. "You'll lose me." Hank had always been proud of his son. When Kyle joined the military, Hank told everyone in town. He had put up Kyle's photo right behind the counter, proud to have a soldier in the family. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had ever really understood what his son had been through. Slowly, he stood up and walked to the wall where Kyle's picture hung. Next to it were photos of other local veterans, men Hank had always shown respect. But tonight, he had turned away a man who had fought for this country just like them. Not just any man, James Carter. The name still sat heavy on his chest. Hank walked back to the counter and sat down again. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. His father had raised him to be tough, to work hard, to never show weakness. Admitting he was wrong was the hardest thing in the world for him. But the truth was clear. He had been wrong. With a sigh, Hank reached for the old landline phone behind the counter. His hands felt heavy as he dialed a number he knew well. After a few rings, a voice answered. "Kyle." There was silence for a moment before Kyle finally spoke. "Dad." Hank swallowed hard. I need to talk to you." Kyle didn't say anything right away. Then, "Go ahead." Hank exhaled slowly, trying to find the right words. "I messed up." The words tasted strange in his mouth, but he forced himself to keep going. "I was wrong about James Carter. About what I did to him tonight." Kyle didn't respond, but Hank knew he was listening. "I don't know why I did it," Hank admitted. "Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I was just being a stubborn old fool." He rubbed his face, feeling exhausted. "But when you said you were ashamed of me, that hit me hard." Kyle sighed on the other end. "Dad, I didn't say that to hurt you. I said it because it's the truth." Hank nodded, even though Kyle couldn't see him. "I know, and you were right." There was another pause. Then Kyle's voice softened. "So, what now?" Hank ran a hand through his graying hair. "I don't know, but I need to make it right." Kyle let out a breath. "That's a start." Hank hesitated before asking, "Do you know where James is?" Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I do." Hank gripped the phone a little tighter. "Can you take me to him?" Kyle didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was steady. "Yeah, Dad, I can." Hank exhaled, relief washing over him. "All right, tomorrow then." "Tomorrow," Kyle agreed. Then, before hanging up, he added, "I hope you mean it, Dad, because this isn't just about one apology. It's about changing the way you see people." Hank closed his eyes for a moment. "I know, son." As he hung up the phone, he sat in silence. He wasn't sure if James Carter would accept his apology. He wasn't sure if Kyle would ever fully forgive him. But for the first time in a long time, he knew one thing for certain. He had to try. The next morning, Hank Dawson stood outside his diner, hands in his pockets. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet town. He hadn't slept much. His mind had been racing all night, thinking about what he was about to do. Kyle pulled up in his truck and rolled down the window. "You ready?" he asked. Hank took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." Without another word, he climbed into the passenger seat. The drive was silent at first, except for the hum of the engine. Kyle finally spoke. "James doesn't owe you anything," he said. "You should know that before we get there." Hank nodded slowly. "I know." Kyle glanced at him. "And this isn't just about saying sorry once and moving on. If you really want to make things right, it takes more than words." Hank sighed. "I get it, son." Kyle didn't reply, but he kept driving. They soon reached a small, quiet house on the edge of town. James Carter's house. Hank felt his stomach tighten. He had faced plenty of tough situations in life, but this felt harder than all of them. Kyle parked the truck and looked at his father. "You sure about this?" Hank swallowed and nodded. "Yeah." They stepped out of the truck and walked up the short path to the front door. Kyle knocked. A few moments later, the door opened, and James Carter stood there. He looked at Kyle first, then at Hank. His expression was calm, but unreadable. "Morning," James said. Kyle nodded. "Morning, sir." He stepped aside. "My dad has something to say." Hank felt the weight of James's steady gaze. For a moment, he wasn't sure he could get the words out. But then he thought about Kyle, about the shame he had felt, about the man standing in front of him who had once saved his son's life. "I was wrong," Hank said, his voice quieter than usual. James raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Hank cleared his throat. "I treated you badly. I disrespected you. And I shouldn't have." He looked James in the eye. "I'm sorry." James studied him for a long moment. "Are you sorry because you realized you were wrong, or because your son called you out on it?" Hank hesitated. The truth was, it had started because of Kyle. But now, standing here, looking at James, he realized it was more than that. "I'm sorry because I judged you before I knew you," Hank admitted. "I spent my whole life thinking a certain way. And last night, I finally saw how wrong that way was." James crossed his arms. "It's easy to say sorry, harder to change." Hank nodded. "I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to do better." There was another long silence. Kyle looked between them, his expression tense. Finally, James sighed. "I've dealt with men like you before, Hank. Some never change." Hank felt his chest tighten. He had expected this. He deserved this. But then James continued, "But some do." Hank looked up. James studied him a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "I guess we'll see which one you are." Relief washed over Hank, but he knew this was just the beginning. James didn't invite them in, but he didn't close the door in their faces either. And for now, that was enough. For the next few days, Hank Dawson couldn't stop thinking about James Carter's words. Some never change, but some do. Hank wanted to prove he could change, but he didn't know how. A simple apology wasn't enough. James had made that clear. And Kyle had warned him too. If he wanted to make things right, he had to do more than just say sorry. One morning, Hank stood behind the counter in his diner, lost in thought. The usual customers came in for their coffee and breakfast, but he wasn't paying much attention. Then the bell above the door jingled. Hank looked up, and his breath caught. James Carter had just walked in. The diner fell silent. Everyone had heard about what happened that night. They all knew how Hank had treated James, and how his own son had stood up to him. Hank swallowed hard and wiped his hands on his apron. James looked around, then walked toward the counter. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. "Morning," James said. Hank nodded quickly. "Morning." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then James glanced at the menu hanging on the wall. "What's good here?" he asked. Hank blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, well, the pancakes are real good, and folks say we have the best coffee in town." James nodded. "I'll take both." Hank hesitated for only a second before he turned and started preparing the order himself. He didn't hand it off to his cook like he usually did. This was something he needed to do. As he flipped the pancakes, he heard whispers from the other customers. They were watching closely, waiting to see what would happen. Hank ignored them. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting this right. A few minutes later, he placed a plate of fresh pancakes and a hot cup of coffee in front of James. James looked down at the food, then up at Hank. "How much?" Hank shook his head. "It's on the house." James raised an eyebrow. "I can pay for my own meal." Hank exhaled, then nodded. "All right. $2.50. James reached into his wallet and placed the money on the counter. Hank took it, feeling strangely relieved. James took a bite of the pancakes, chewed slowly, then nodded. Not bad. Hank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. James sipped his coffee, then looked up. Why are you doing this, Hank? Hank wiped his hands on a towel. Because I was wrong, he said honestly, and because I don't want to be that man anymore. James studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a small, almost invisible nod. We'll see. Hank didn't expect more than that. James finished his meal, left a tip on the counter, and stood up. Just before he walked out, he looked over his shoulder and said, I'll be back. Hank watched him go, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next morning, Hank Dawson arrived at his diner earlier than usual. The air was crisp, and the sun had barely started to rise. He stood outside for a moment, looking at the small restaurant he had run for years. It had always been his pride. But now he realized something. What good was a business if it didn't welcome everyone? With a deep breath, he pulled out a screwdriver and walked over to the window. There, hanging in the corner, was an old faded sign that read, We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. It had been there for as long as Hank could remember. He had never thought much about it before. But now he knew it had to go. He unscrewed the sign, pulled it down, and tossed it in the trash. As he walked inside, he saw Kyle sitting at the counter, sipping a cup of coffee. His son raised an eyebrow. Didn't think I'd ever see that happen, Kyle said, nodding toward the trash. Hank poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. Figured it was time for a change, he said simply. Kyle studied him for a moment, then smiled a little. I'm proud of you, Dad. Hank didn't say anything, but those words meant more to him than he could express. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled. Hank turned and saw James Carter walking in. He wasn't alone. Beside him was a group of men, some older, some younger, all wearing jackets with military patches. Hank felt his chest tighten. He knew what this was. Word had gotten around. James had told others. And now they were here to see if Hank's change was real. James walked up to the counter and looked Hank in the eye. We figured we'd give this place another chance, he said. That a problem? Hank shook his head. Not at all. James nodded. Good, because we're hungry. The other veterans chuckled, and Hank smiled. An honest, real smile. Then take a seat. Breakfast is on me. James raised an eyebrow. I told you, Hank. I can pay for my own meal. Hank chuckled. All right. But coffee's free. James considered this for a moment, then nodded. Fair deal. As the group took their seats, Hank grabbed a notepad and started taking their orders himself. Other customers watched, surprised at the sight, but no one said a word. They just sipped their coffee and went back to their meals. Kyle leaned on the counter, watching his father move around the diner. Looks like you've got some new regulars, he said. Hank glanced at James, who was laughing with the other veterans. He nodded. Yeah, I think I do. For the first time in a long time, Hank Dawson didn't just feel like a business owner. He felt like a better man. And that, he realized, was worth more than anything.